My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Gretchen Morgenson. Gretchen is the senior financial reporter for the NBC News Investigations Unit. A former stockbroker, she won the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for her trenchant and incisive reporting on Wall Street, as well as 2 Gerald Loeb Awards, the top honor for business reporting. Previously at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, she and co-author Joshua Rosner wrote the New York Times bestseller Reckless Endangerment about the origins of the 2008 financial crisis. I start my conversation today with Gretchen Morgenson with a definition of private equity and an explanation of how it is supposed to work. Unfortunately, the reality is often much different. Gretchen describes the bad and often illegal activities of many private equity firms, and then attempts to explain why they have been allowed to get away with them for so very long. She explains how private equity firms operate behind the scenes to ensure the loopholes that substantially reduce their tax bills are never closed. And we finish by recounting recent events that might give cause for hope. I bring you my conversation with Gretchen Morgenson. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Gretchen Morgenson, thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
I'm happy to be here, Leslie. Thanks for having me.
So the reason I'm having you on the show today is I want to talk to you about your book, These Are the Plunderers, and the subtitle is How Private Equity Runs and Wrecks America. And our listeners are, generally speaking, scientifically literate. We talk a lot about science, about religion and philosophy, politics, broadly speaking. But I think that a lot of our listeners don't have a lot of grounding in business and finance. So can we start by having you tell us what private equity is?
Certainly. Leslie, private equity is maybe what people think of when they remember back to the 1980s and 90s, the leveraged buyout sort of rush that we saw. Back in the 86 or 87, like that, R.J. Nabisco was the big name in leveraged buyouts. It really was the first deal that kind of got everybody's attention. And so private equity is leveraged buyouts. They decided to change the name because they didn't like what leveraged buyout sort of conveyed, which was the, use of debt, which is leverage. And it sort of got a bad name in the greed is good era of the 80s. And so private equity was a sort of more genteel identifier for them. And they took on
a rebranding. Okay.
A rebranding. But it is the leveraged buyout business. What they do is these firms go out and, first of all, they raise money from investors, mostly public pensions, endowments, big institutions. They raise money and then they look for companies that they can buy. They lever those companies up. They put a lot of debt on them to do the transaction. And then they hope to flip them, sell them in 5 to 7 to 10 years at a profit. So there's always this idea that they're going to improve the operating results of the company. They're going to streamline it. They're going to make it more efficient. And that's how they're going to be able to generate a higher price for the company when they go to sell it in 5 to 7 years. Make sense?
So that does make sense. And if I can just bring it down to a kind of a human level, that sounds that sounds similar to, at least in principle, like people that buy a house with a lot of debt. They put like the minimum down payment. They get a lot of debt. They buy a house or a condo or an apartment building. Then they spend some number of months or even years renovating it in the hopes that they then sell it down the road for a higher price. They take the profits and then they can buy another house and renovate that. So if a private equity firm sees a distressed company or a company that's not being run as well as it might be, they get capital from investors, they get some debt, they purchase the company, they make improvements, they sell it a few years down the road, realize the profits. If if it actually worked that way in reality, do you object to private equity in principle? Is there anything wrong with that as a business model?
I do not object to companies that are bought and sold by investors. That is absolutely fine. People do it all day long on the New York Stock Exchange, on the Toronto. And so that's not a problem. There certainly is no problem with buying a distressed company, as you noted, and sort of fixing it up, maybe, bringing some fresh blood in, figuring out what's wrong, why it's distressed, and then selling it at a profit. That's perfectly fine, and a traditional way to make money in our capitalist system. It's the problem becomes this, the business model becomes problematic when they are taking companies that are not necessarily distressed, and they're amassing a lot of debt, putting a lot of debt on them, which increases their expenses, which of course makes it harder for them to operate. So the debt is a big pressure point in this equation. And then have this short-term turnaround time or short-term period in which you need to dress the company up, make it look like it's doing better so that you can flip it. So there are two pressure points in this business model that I see. And one is the debt, which increases the costs associated with the company's operations. And two, the second one is the short-term mentality that you've got to make this thing look better in 5 to 7 years. Now, there are other elements to the business practice of private equity that are quite pernicious and that really do damage to the companies that they
Okay.
buy.
All right.
And
Well, we can get to those in a moment,
okay,
but
okay,
I want to pause there and focus on the debt that you are talking about.
right.
So I'm going to quote from your book because there's something that I don't understand, and I'm hoping that you can explain it to me. So,
Uh-oh, if
uh,
I didn't do a good job, if you didn't
uh,
understand it, I didn't do a good job. So,
so Apollo paid $1.2 billion for a company called Miranda, but only about 200 million of that 1.2 billion was Apollo's money.
right,
The remaining $1 billion necessary to fund the transaction came from debt raised by Miranda.
right.
There's another example that you put in the book where KKR took Toys R Us private in 2005, buying it for $6.6 billion and piling $5 billion in debt onto the company. And then a few years later, Toys R Us was bankrupt. Now, here's the part that I don't understand. If I'm buying Gretchen Inc. and I pay $1 billion for it because Gretchen is an amazing company and it's worth $1 billion. Fine. I understand that I might have to raise a whole bunch of debt, but then I spend that $1 billion to buy your company. Now, Leslie Inc. has $800 million worth of debt, but you've got $1 billion of cash. How does my debt transfer from Leslie Inc. onto Gretchen Inc.? That's the part that I'm missing. If I'm buying your company, how is it that you're assuming the debt?
Okay, so the fund, the private equity fund or the firm is buying the company for the fund, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the company is the issuer of the debt. So in the case of Noranda,
Mm-hmm.
Apollo buys the company. They agree to make the transaction. They agree to buy it at whatever the price was. And typically these firms put up only 1 to 2% of their own money to do so. So with the other pension money, the institutional money, that is what makes up perhaps the 200 million that you were talking about in the Noranda case. But the rest of it, the bulk of the transaction, is paid for by debt that Noranda issues to the public. Okay.
So the company that's being acquired is paying for their own acquisition?
That's right. That's right.
Why? So, okay, then I've got another question. Why would Noranda or Toys R Us or any company a- a- agree to that? Like, if I'm buying your company and I'm going to load you up with debt and you're paying for the acquisition, like, why don't you just tell Leslie Inc. to pound sand?
Because the seller of Noranda wants that money. Okay. There's a seller that's selling
Okay,
Miranda to Apollo.
I see.
They want the 1.2 billion dollars, and they don't care where it comes from.
Right.
They don't care that a billion of it goes onto the shoulders of Miranda after the transaction occurs. All they care about is getting their 1.2 billion dollars, and they walk away and thank you very much.
Right. So there, it's the when a company is public, the company itself doesn't. It's owned
Right.
by the shareholders,
That's
and
right.
the shareholders say, "Hey, I can cash out, and
Right. That's right.
because I'm cashing out, I don't care about the future prospects of the company. I've got my money, and that's
And
why the transaction goes through."
they're taking it private, remember. Now, in the
Okay.
case of Noranda, I think it might have been, I forget, I think it might have been owned by another company. So sometimes these acquisitions are owned by another company, so it wouldn't be on the stock market, on the stock exchange. But yes, you understand, it's the seller is getting completely liquefied. They're getting all their money out, but Noranda, the company, ends up with an enormous amount of debt
Okay. So
to
thank you.
fund the transaction.
That explains how that worked, because I couldn't that didn't make a lot of sense to me. Now you mentioned that in addition to loading up the companies that they purchase with enormous amounts of debt, that's the leverage of the leverage buyout, now known as private equity. There were other pernicious aspects of the business model. So what else do they do that you think is less than kosher?
Okay. Very, very crucially, when a private equity firm goes after a company to buy it, they are very, very good at highlighting or making sure that there are assets that that company owns that they can perhaps strip, that they can extract cash from. And so you have a situation that we write about in the book, Manor Care, which was a very large nursing home company in the US. And it was purchased by Carlyle Group, a very prestigious private equity firm. And Carlyle, I think it was around a year after the transaction, sold all of the real estate that Manor Care owned under every one of its nursing homes. So Manor Care, when it was previous to the time it was bought by Carlyle, owned all the real estate under its nursing homes. So it did not have rental costs. It of course had maintenance costs, but it was not paying to, sit on the property. It wasn't paying a landlord. Now, Manor Care is bought by Carlyle. Carlyle sees, wow, real estate assets. That's a plus. Let's sell the real estate underneath the nursing homes to a buyer, and we'll take our money out. And then Manor Care is saddled with rental expenses. Okay. And what happened in that case was perfect because it was almost immediately a problem for Manor Care. The moment that transaction occurred, the rent expenses were so high for the company that it started losing money and ultimately it went bankrupt. So these firms are always looking for assets that they can sell, that they can strip, that they can extract money from. And that's another problem in addition to loading up with debt.
So okay, so that gets to like the other question, another question that I had, which is uh, how the companies, how private equity do get their money back. Like if I purchase again Gretchen Inc. for $1 billion, I may load up the purchase price uh, or in terms of debt and saddle Gretchen Inc. with that debt, but I still put up 20% or something of the amount that went in. How do I get that money back? So the answer is they target companies with assets that they can then strip. So why I guess and that value wasn't reflected in the share price or in the purchase price. They were able to get a discount compared to the amount of money that they could extract by selling the assets and then renting them back.
Well, yes, in the ManorCare example, in fact, they got all of their money out when they did the real estate transaction. So Carlyle and their investors were completely repaid from their entire investment at the moment it did the real estate transaction. So everything after that would be gravy. And so it was almost like, of course, they want a return over and above what they paid and what they put in. But you see, once the company went bankrupt, it wasn't a disaster for them because they'd gotten their money out. So the company goes bankrupt, but it doesn't hurt the financiers who did the transaction because they extracted those $6 billion in real estate
And
from.
and hence the plunderers of your title.
That's right. And so it's very clever, and it's very, if it didn't affect millions of people every year, if it didn't affect workers, if it didn't affect customers, if it didn't affect pensioners, it would be fine. It would be okay. Look at these guys. They're really smart. They're really shrewd. They're doing a fantastic job, financializing whatever the company is. But unfortunately, there are many people who are hurt by these practices. And if you want a really stark example, the one that just really, really was wrenching to me was the study done by academics at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Chicago, and NYU, which they did a longitudinal study about the impact of private equity ownership on nursing homes. And what they found was that if a nursing home is owned by private equity, its residents experience mortality, death, 10% more than non-private equity owned nursing homes. And this accounted for about 22,000 deaths over the period of time that this study looked at it. So there could not be a more clear example of what happens when private equity gets involved, especially in healthcare, because it's all about making things more efficient, and that often translates to firing people, reducing staff. And I did speak to one of the researchers on that paper, and she said, yes, we concluded that the reason that these firms had higher mortality rates was because they cut staff.
Right, and I'm all for efficiency. If you can do the same amount of work with fewer staff or with less money, I think that's great. That's progress. That's fantastic. But it sounds like they're not being more efficient. They're just cutting people and saying you need to do the same amount of work, and there's not enough people to do the work that's required.
And that's particularly troubling in healthcare.
Yeah, well, there's competing priorities, right? With
Right,
healthcare, the top
right.
priority is, well, healthcare, the lives of the people, of the patients, and in business, the top priority is profit. And I guess that some there's no shortage of examples in of corporations placing profit over people's well-being or people's lives,
Right.
unfortunately.
And it's not like this is a new concept, but Leslie, what I think this is, and this was somebody else's quote, but I expropriated it with credit to him, and that is that private equity is capitalism on steroids. It is I sort of also characterize it as do you remember that old Beatles song, I, Me, Mine? It's like I, me, mine capitalism. It's just about benefiting themselves, and they do not care about the big circle of stakeholders that they are impacting. like the Noranda situation was so compelling. So this was a story of an aluminum smelter on the Mississippi River in a poor area of Missouri, the Boot Hill region. And it was the employer in town. This was a small town. It was the biggest employer. They had, like, I don't know, 2,500 jobs. And it had been there for a long time. It had prospered. Apollo buys it. They take their money out almost immediately. So they're flat, they're free and clear. Everything above that is profit for them. And they lever it up with debt, and they start to have difficulties. The price of aluminum drops, and they start to fire people. Um, then they start to ask the state utility regulator for lower electricity costs. Now, all of these problems would never have occurred had it not had all the debt levied onto it and had Apollo not taken all the money out from those debt issuances. So you've got a situation where the company is being hobbled by the debt. And so what happens is Noranda goes bankrupt, 2,500 people lose their jobs, three pensions, company pensions, go bankrupt, have to be rescued by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp, which is the U.S. Backer of corporate pensions. And because it was the biggest employer in the town, it did not pay the taxes that it needed to pay for the schools to continue operating to the level that they had been, i.e., school children went without books, school teachers had to pay their own health insurance, all because of this greed that had taken over with the acquisition of Noranda by Apollo. So Apollo didn't care that the company went bankrupt, but the school children, the employees, the pensioners, the taxpayers who back the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, and even utility ratepayers across the state of Missouri had to pick up the costs that there were higher costs to them because Apollo got a lower electricity rate um, initially on the Noranda factory. So that is a perfect example of the what I call the circle of pain that these kinds of practices involve.
And yet, and there's more. There's even more to it. So I'm just going to quote a line from your book. There is a loophole that lets them, and them is the private equity titans. A loophole lets them pay 15% on their income versus far higher rates levied on working class and wage earning taxpayers. Now, I remember hearing that Warren Buffett was complaining that he pays less taxes than his secretary does.
Right.
And and so and he I mean he did pay less taxes, but at least he was complaining about it and drawing attention to it. So what is this loophole that allows private equity, if they're enormously profitable, okay, fine, maybe not fine, but so be it, they're enormously profitable, why aren't they paying taxes, or why are they paying only a 15% tax instead of what anyone else would pay if they made that much profit? Why does it, like, what is it and why does it exist at all?
Well, right now, the rate has gone up a little bit to 21%, but that's still far below the 39% that is the very highest ordinary income tax rate. So what it is it's an accounting loophole. If you have an investment in a property, it started out in the real estate industry, but what it is they treat their income as capital gains. So in the US, there are two different tax rates. One, if for your ordinary income, your salary, your dividends that you take on stocks, etc., that's called ordinary income. And then capital gains is what you take if you've held a stock for over a year, for example. And so they give you a lower rate on your capital gains. Well, what the private equity titans have mostly in their income is capital gains. And so that's how they're allowed to pay this much lower rate. And it really is a loophole. And every time someone tries to change it, and many people have, the most recent being Joe Biden, the money floods into Washington. And somehow the idea of eliminating this loophole disappears and people go along their merry way. So it's really abusive, and it's a real factor in what is propelling these people forward to do these kinds of transactions.
So when a private equity firm purchases a company and they take it private, and then they're the sole owners of the company, so they can do basically whatever they want
Right.
without any checks or balances. Okay, because I in some of the situations that you describe, I was thinking to myself, why would the company agree to this? Well, and one example that you gave is that Taminco's $35 million payment to Apollo was for services Apollo would never have to render. It was the equivalent, you write, of paying money for nothing. And I thought, okay, that's a great deal for Apollo. If I could get money for nothing, if I could figure that out, I would love it. But I couldn't understand why on earth would Taminco agree to this? Why wouldn't they demand or sue for a refund? But if they're owned by, in this case it was Apollo, they have no say. That
That's
you
right.
do what the boss you do
That's
what the boss says. Okay,
And don't forget that Apollo installs their management at these companies, okay? And Apollo and all of the firms in these cases, they have 3 board members or 2 board members that are monitoring the operation, keeping an eye on things. And so it really is, they are in control of the company. And so if they want to charge those fees, the money for nothing fees, the company has no ability to say no because
okay.
they're talking to the owners, and the owner doesn't care. The owner normally the owner would care and say, no, I don't want to pay those. But in this case, the owner is receiving the money. So the owner is deeply conflicted and, doesn't care about the outcome. Again, it goes back to this small, very small percentage of their own money that these people put into these deals, the rest of it being other people's money, and then ultimately so much debt. So yeah, those fees, those money for nothing fees were really egregious, and the firms weren't even telling their investors about them, and so the SEC cracked down on that actually, and some of the firms have actually stopped doing those kinds of fees. They're called monitoring fees, and the idea was that the firm was so knowledgeable about how to run a company that they're giving, in this case, Taminco advice on how to run itself profitably, and so they were being paid for it.
Right. And that goes back to how we started the conversation, which is that, at least in principle, a private equity firm might improve a company and make it better, and thus increase its value for a resale down the road. And that's what I was thinking of, because you write roughly 20% of private equity buyouts had filed for bankruptcy after 10 years versus 2% among other companies. And I
Right.
was thinking to myself, but is that a fair comparison? If private equity targets distressed companies, focuses on companies on the edge where they can come in and rescue a flailing company, they buy at a discount, reap big rewards if they actually manage to rescue it. That's the all to the good, but that would mean that purchases are biased to high risk positions compared to the general population of companies. But what you're saying is that while that could be what a private equity firm does, at least in principle, that's not the practice. That in reality, that's not how they operate. Is that true?
Well, what's interesting, Leslie, is that initially, when this business started, when it really started to gain traction in the 80s, there was a real arbitrage to be done. There was a difference between what the public markets were valuing companies at and what those companies' true value was. And that was because we had this terrible period in the 70s when stocks were in the doldrum, inflation was terrible, energy costs going through the roof. And so you had this difference between the reality of a company's value and the market's perception of that, which was lower than the actual
Right.
value. So in the early days, and I say 80s, even into the 90s, there genuinely were opportunities for this arbitrage to occur where you would go in and say, oh, look, this really is undervalued, this company. The market thinks it's, a dog. I think it's got some possibilities here. Let's buy it. We can lever it up and we'll, it'll the markets will the valuations will converge and we'll be able to sell at a profit. So that was where it sort of started. But now we have had so many of these transactions, and these companies have been flipped so many times, and they're now being flipped to each other, and private equity firm buying another private equity firm's company, that there is so much less of that arbitrage available. And so you're starting to actually see the returns in this section of the market in private equity. You're starting to see them decline.
Yeah, I mean, the way you describe it, these are not companies that are investing in failing companies and building them
Right.
up, but they're
That's right.
parasitical. They find a healthy target, suck it dry, and then leave the empty husk
That's right.
to go bankrupt for other people to pick up the pieces. It's kind of astonishing that private equity doesn't have a worse reputation as a result. You write in the book that there are at least some private equity firms are becoming concerned about their reputation. So Apollo launched the Apollo Opportunity Foundation last year and said it was going to invest $100 million over 10 years in nonprofit organizations working to expand opportunity for underrepresented individuals. Now, that sounds great, $10 million per year for underrepresented individuals. So, is this an example of private equity developing a conscience? Or is it sort of indirectly buying favorable press, and maybe $10 million a year is worth the good press it's going to get, and it's actually a discount compared to buying an equal number of investments, of advertisements?
Well, I certainly think it's a drop in the bucket for Apollo to dedicate $100 million. I mean, uh,
What percentage of the profits
oh
of
my
its
gosh,
profits?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but don't forget that Leon Black paid Jeffrey Epstein $158 million for his tax advice, and that was what got Leon Black sort of banished from the company he founded after that came out. So, okay, 158 million for tax advice, but Apollo is going to dedicate 100 million for the betterment of under whatever the description was. It's really a blip on the screen. And so you try to, I guess it gets a few good headlines and some good publicity, but it certainly doesn't begin to undo the damage that has been done by some of these firms over the years. You see, we've got enough academic research to show things like after these buyouts, employment drops by 13% typically. So you have job losses that are substantial and that are meaningful. And again, the bankruptcy rate, which you mentioned, which is 10 times with leveraged buyouts to the alternative. Then you have the mortality rates in nursing homes. I mean, it just the numbers really don't lie, and they do try, I think, to persuade people that they're doing the right thing. This is capitalism. This is what our world is all about. But I think that people are starting to get it. And one of the things that happen now, these firms are very behind the scenes. You don't see their names in lights in the companies that they own. One of the biggest, I think, surprises for many people is when I tell them that 40% of the U.S. hospital emergency departments are run by private equity companies. So you have these management staffing companies that are private equity owned running the emergency department. Now, it doesn't say, KKR emergency department. It doesn't say Blackstone emergency department. You don't know that you're going into an emergency department that's run by a company that is extremely profit oriented. But it was in these emergency departments that the surprise medical billing really rose. And that was where you would go to your hospital. Now, you're in Canada, so you don't have this problem. But in the US, you have to have insurance, and your insurance has to cover where you're going. So you're either in network or not in network. And the idea is to be in network because your insurance company will pay more for your treatment. So what happened was one of these private equity owned emergency department staffing companies decided, well, we'll just carve out the emergency department from the network that the hospital is in, from the insurance network. We'll carve that out. No longer be in network. And that will mean that we can charge the patient for whatever the insurance company would have paid, right? So they'll pay the difference. And sometimes these bills were thousands of dollars. Nobody knew this was happening. Nobody knew that their hospital emergency department was different from the rest of the hospital in the way that it would be billed, their services would be billed. So this created such an uproar in this country because people were getting these massive bills that Congress, our dysfunctional Congress, actually did something about it and passed a law that curbed this practice. Okay. So it's just really everywhere. These companies own all kinds of different firms that you don't know they own, and the impact is great. And when people finally focus on it, they say, wait a minute, this is wrong.
So a lot of the examples that you've used, including these hospital emergency wards, this is all very public, right? Then
Yep.
when aluminum smelters fail, that's like well known. The Toys R Us bankruptcy. I mean, everyone my age has fond memories of Toys R Us, and now it's just a memory. So I can private equity does not have a great reputation, and one that I think you would argue is its poor reputation is well deserved. You write in your book that recent data show private equity's returns are no better than a low-cost and transparent Standard & Poor's index fund that invests in public companies.
Right.
So my question is, if that's true, why is private equity still a mammoth trillion-plus-dollar industry? Why do sophisticated investors continue to give them billions of dollars every year?
This is the $64 trillion question, Leslie. And I cannot answer the question, but I have asked it myself. You can certainly hope that some of these institutions, particularly the public pension funds that are underfunded, that have more obligations than they have money to pay for, and that is almost all any public pension in the United States, you would hope that they would start to see that these returns are falling, and so therefore that they're not going to help them meet those obligations that they have down the line. In addition, that private equity is opaque. You don't know what you own, and it's high cost. You're paying enormous management fees for these.
You write in your book that it's 2% of assets and 20% of profits. Is that typical, or is that specific to one company?
That's typical.
So, I mean, 2% of assets seems at least reasonable to me. I'm a non-expert, but I have access. I have mutual funds, for example, and 2% is. Well, some of them are.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh boy. Well, I hope they're good
In,
performers. I mean,
well,
an S&P index fund will charge you zero.
yes. In index funds are much less, but
Right,
actively traded mutual
right,
funds, like if those
right.
ones are like 1.5 to 2.5. So 2% seems like middle of the road for an
Okay.
actively traded fund. But the 20% of profits, well, that's a sweetener. But
Yeah.
that's um, but like, is that exorbitant? I mean, it seems to me that like that would be disclosed up front, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
you
Oh,
can't
definitely, definitely.
so again, if you know that you're
Yeah,
paying 2%, and
right.
if that's too
They were
much,
happy to do it because they did receive higher returns. Okay.
okay,
All those years. So starting in the 90s, going through the 2000s, even 2010, it really was, they were creating excess returns greater than what you might get elsewhere.
okay,
But that has stopped. We are
right,
now in the position of saying that these things are reverting to the mean and that they are not generating what's called alpha, which is a return that's outsized or excess to a benchmark. They are no longer generating those higher returns, and they are still expensive. They are still illiquid, meaning you cannot sell if you need the money. You have to hold for the period, generally speaking, 7 to 10 years, and they are opaque. And it's a mystery to me why these pension funds continue to pour money into the. Now, that's stopping a little bit, Leslie, because they are they have certain benchmarks that they can't go above the amount that they invest in a particular asset class, and they're up to their eyeballs in private
okay.
equity.
So they're maxed out.
So they're maxed out, and so
Okay.
they're no longer adding to their portfolios, but and they can't get out. And we're starting to see more bankruptcies because of higher interest rates. The Federal Reserve in this country has been raising rates
Yeah.
aggressively,
Similar situation in Canada.
yeah. And all of these companies that do these leveraged buyouts, they raise money from the floating rate debt market. They do not buy fixed rate. They do not issue fixed rate debt. And so when the interest rates ratchet up, their costs ratchet up. So we're starting to see corporate bankruptcies increase. And so we're starting to see people are figuring it out. This business model has to have perfection. Perfection in interest rates. It has to be zero, right? For this business model to really work. That's no longer the case. And so you're starting to see this is not a sustainable business model when rates are going up and when scrutiny is being paid to it. I really believe it's almost you really should think about it in the same category of sustainability that you look at with other parts of the investing world.
So private equity firms don't operate in a vacuum, and I want to ask about the other players in the that affect the industry. So, you mentioned YRC, which is a trucking company owned by a private equity firm, and you write YRC received a $700 million bailout from the United States Treasury, even though it was under investigation by the Justice Department for overcharging the government for trucking services. Now,
Right.
I completely understand why YRC would want the money, but why on earth would the Treasury, why would the US government bail out a company that the US government was investigating for fraud? Like, does the US government not is it a case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing? Is it a case of just not performing even the most minuscule amount of due diligence? Like, what's going on there? Help me understand.
I would love to understand, and nobody will explain it. It is inexplicable. It's either incompetence or some sort of conflict. I don't know the answer. I am speculating here. It could be that the Treasury right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. That seems bizarre because this was well known. This was public information. The Justice Department information was out there. Okay. So you didn't have to get out your backhoe to dig up this information. You could dig it up with a spoon. Okay. Now, so was there some involvement by the private equity firm and the Treasury Department and saying, please help us? This is in the middle of COVID. Returns are plummeting. The stock market's in dire condition. We need, and they'll always say jobs. We have so many jobs at stake here. You really must help us. Please bail us out. I mean, could that have happened? Absolutely. These are very powerful people. They have a lot of money and they can throw it around in Washington, and it's very effective. I do not know the answer, but I agree with you. It is a burning question.
I've got a bunch of questions along these lines, and I'm hoping that at least some of them you'll have answers to.
I
But
am so sorry I can't answer that one.
okay, so all right, here's another question I have, and this was kind of shocked me when I read this in your book. You said KKR, which is the name of a private equity firm, one of the large ones. KKR supplied data to Congress showing leveraged buyouts created jobs and innovations. And then later on, a couple paragraphs later, you also write KKR's upbeat data had omitted from its calculation the takeovers that had gone bankrupt. Like that's like heads I win, tails you lose. Like that's great. I have a record of 100% success if you don't count my failures. So my question to you is, isn't lying to Congress, like providing false information to Congress, akin to perjury? And are there any penalties for doing so? And even if there isn't a criminal aspect to this, why would Congress or anyone else ever trust anything KKR says if they're willing to lie under oath to Congress?
Okay. There's so many parts of that question. Let me just start with lying to Congress. If you could point out to me one example of a person who was prosecuted for lying to Congress, I would be very interested in that, because those never happen.
Is it illegal, or is it just
It is
people?
illegal. It's
It
Yes.
is illegal, but no one has
No
ever
one enforces it.
held to account for that.
No
Okay.
one is ever held to account. So that's that. Now, keep in mind, these numbers were delivered to Congress by KKR. KKR didn't provide all the backup numbers. What KKR said was, look, we created whatever the numbers were, X number of new jobs with our 25 portfolio companies that we bought. I'm making up numbers because I don't have it right in front of me. Unless Congress is going to go back to KKR and say, please provide the data backing up these numbers, then they're just going to buy it. And they did just buy it. And the only reason we know that it was false was because an academic went back and crunched the numbers years later and found that it was false. So this brings up to me an issue that I had when I was working on this book. I went to all of the major firms, Leslie, and I said, here's my thesis. My thesis is that your industry destroys jobs, harms workers, harms pensions, enriches a small number of people, and harms a great number of people. And of course, all of them said, you're wrong, here's what. Now, Blackstone came back to me and said, we, of course, disagree with your thesis. In fact, over the past 15 years, we have created 200,000 net new jobs in the portfolio companies that we own.
That's a strong statement, and it
That's a
sounds great.
strong statement. I said to them, fantastic. I'm thrilled to have that information. Please provide the data behind it. They had asked me to provide the data behind my questions to them, which I provided. Happy to do that. Okay.
Fair question, fair request. Yes.
Right. I asked them, please provide the data for the 200,000 net new jobs that you've created in the past 15 years. And they were maintaining that their companies go bankrupt at a far lower rate than the numbers that we've talked about already. So I said, great, fantastic, give me the data behind it. We respectfully decline. Okay? So it's the same thing KKR did to Congress. They give
Right.
you this top line number, 50,
But
200,000 new
but it could
jobs.
be, but whether it's true or not, it could be completely made up. They may have generated no jobs at all, but
Right.
we
Could have
don't
had
know because there's nothing underlying the claim.
nothing underlying the claim.
Yes.
Yet they
Well,
make that claim constantly.
one of the things that the Center for Inquiry Canada is very fond of is evidence-based reasoning and evidence-based public
Right.
policy. And so
That's
here we have a claim that's completely unsubstantiated, and they are respectfully declining to
right.
provide the evidence underlying it.
Right. So
Okay. Well,
this is why, your question about KKR and lying to Congress is, fast forward, that was 1989 or something. Fast forward to 2023. And the same thing is happening. They're making claims that they do not um, provide the backup for.
so sometimes these companies are held to account, or at least there's attempts. You mentioned that the private equity firm Riordan, Lewis and Hayden paid $21 million to settle charges of fraud and kickback schemes, but there was no determination of liability. Alliance and Ancor were charged with kickbacks and submitting false claims to Medicare, also settled for $15 million. Neither company admitted the allegations. Aspen Dental, also owned by a private equity firm, they generated $645 million in annual revenue, but they were being investigated by the Department of Justice and had to pay less than $500,000 to make the case disappear. This seems to me, this isn't a problem with private equity as such, but a lack of effective enforcement. You write elsewhere that when attorneys general do bring cases, they should extract fines that are significant enough to get these wealthy firms' attention. And I agree with that sentiment wholeheartedly. So my question to you is, why are the fines so small? Why do the prosecution, the district's attorney, seem to always agree to not find any fault? And why don't they push at least some of the cases forward to find fault? Like if I can make $1 million, sorry, let's say if I can make $100 million from illegal activities, and then I have to pay a penalty of $10 million and no admission of guilt,
Yeah,
I'll
that's a
hang my
great,
head
great.
in great shame, pay my $10 million. Then next year, I'm going to do more illegal activities and
Right.
make another $90 million net from my illegal activities. Why does the government, why does the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, or whoever else is conducting these investigations let these companies off the hook time and time again for just trivial penalties? Like a fine, if a fine is a price and if it's less than the profit that they make, it's almost an encouragement to do it again. Why, Gretchen? Why? I don't understand.
I would love to give you an answer. Again, I'm going to have to beg off and say, this is my question also, 24/7. There are probably a lot of answers. One is that these prosecutors do not want to put companies out of business, that they feel like if they did
But
a,
they're criming.
I know,
Like,
I know.
these are ones where there's evidence, there's an
Right,
investigation, that
right.
their guilt is not established yet in a court of law, but they wouldn't bring these cases if there wasn't strong evidence that
That's
they
right.
are conducted. Like
That's
putting bad companies out of business would be a net benefit. Just like, someone
right.
commits murder or fraud or as an individual or rape, we put them behind bars even though they might have a spouse or children or family members that depend on them, because we as a society think that that's a net benefit. Why does that logic not apply to corporations?
I don't know the answer. It is a
Okay.
complete conundrum and very disturbing. And I think that it contributes to this belief in our country that the system is rigged to support big and powerful entities and people, and that small people who
Mhm.
steal a loaf of bread would go, to jail immediately. But these big shots that conduct questionable activities get off without any penalty whatsoever. We saw that in the mortgage crisis here. We continue to see it. It is a scourge. It is very negative. It is pernicious. It contributes to a belief that this is an unfair system. And I agree with you 1,000%, Leslie. It is wrong. And I don't know why it doesn't happen. But here's another question. Why don't they go after the private equity firm that owns the company? They rarely do that. They don't take it up the ladder to the very, very sophisticated, wealthy, prosperous entity that owns it. They leave it down at the portfolio company. And you and I both know that the portfolio company was doing what it was doing because it was being pressured to make more profits. And so, why on earth do they not go to the source of the pressure to generate profits, which is probably, it probably does not reside solely in the C-suite of the company. You probably have to look further up in the ownership stack of the company. So that's another $1 million question that I do not know the answer to, but that is extremely disturbing because it just rarely happens. Now, ray of sunlight. The FTC, which is our Federal Trade Commission, which is responsible for antitrust actions to promote fair business and to hinder monopolization, they just brought a case against a anesthesia staffing company that was owned by private equity, and they went after the private equity firm as well. So this might be changing. But this was a couple of weeks ago. It's brand new. The case has not been adjudicated. Both of the companies say they will fight it. It's unfair. But the FTC says this company has gained monopoly power. It increased costs for patients, and patient care suffered. And they're going after both the portfolio company and the private equity owner. So that is a positive ray of light in this very dark area.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to encourage our listeners that there are more examples of regulatory bodies not doing what their job ought to be, and I've got several more examples, but I'll skip over them. I'll just quote one line that you have in your book that says, "Why write rules if you're not going to enforce them?" And I think that's an excellent rhetorical question. I think I've got one last question for you, Gretchen. You've been very generous with your
But I
time.
haven't answered them, so I really have fallen down on
Well,
the
there
job.
doesn't seem to be. Well, there doesn't seem to be an answer. I mean, it's not just the private equities, right? It's the private equity firms. It's the environment in which
Yes.
they exist. They are very clear, right? I'll grant them honesty. Why do they exist? We're going to do everything that we can to make as much money as we possibly can, and there are rules to the game. And it would seem like the referees are absent. So if there's no referee, if there's no umpire, there's no consequences to bad behavior, then they'll behave badly if it'll make them extra money because they're just going to maximize profit. So there needs to be rules to the game, and there needs to be enforcement of those rules. And it would seem that for reasons that neither you nor I understand, both of those conditions are lacking.
That's right.
So the last question that I have is that until the last year or two, antitrust in the US and really around the world has been pretty much non-existent
Yep.
for over 20 years, right? The last major case I can think of in the States was against Microsoft for
Right.
bundling Internet Explorer with Windows. And that dates back to the 90s and I
Yep.
think was settled in 2001. But just in the last couple of years, the US has launched major antitrust cases against Google and Amazon. The EU has taken similar actions. I was going to ask if they have targeted private equity. You just answered that question. You ended the note, your book. Your last line in the book was, when I read it, incredibly bleak. It struck me as incredibly bleak, and it says, "It only takes one or two cases to get the looters' attention, and so we wait and hope." So my question to you is there cause for hope?
Well, I think there is. I think the FTC case that I just mentioned is absolutely an indication of a much more of an appetite to go after not only the companies doing these problematic practices, but also the companies that own them. I like to characterize it. It's like a pirate ship that sends, little ships out there. You can't have the little ships without the mother pirate ship sort of directing. So you must really go to the root of the problem. And so that's very encouraging, I think. I think that people are starting to understand, Leslie, this business model, and you're starting to see greater numbers of investors questioning it, individuals and people who really think, wow, I didn't realize this. I didn't know this. I didn't know that this was what their practices were. So I'm just trying to educate people so that they can know what's going on and maybe do their part to fight it. It's very difficult because it's very below the radar. You don't know which companies are owned by private equity. But I think just helping people to understand this business model and how pernicious it is a start. And I just hope that people will begin to be able to make decisions and certainly not invest with these companies because of what their impact is on so many stakeholders.
So, Gretchen Morgenson, author of These Are the Plunderers. Thank you for a fascinating conversation, and thank you for writing this book and documenting all of these abuses in one place. That you're doing your part to raise awareness.
Well, thank you for having me, Leslie, and I am really, really keen to listen to your podcast in the future.
Thanks again. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web and Facebook and Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazzaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.